This time it's 6 classic British 500cc parallel twins of the 1950s. When Edward Turner released the first Triumph Speed Twin in 1938, it was of course not Triumph's first parallel twin, but Turner did hope that it would be successful. But I don't think even in his wildest of dreams that Edward Turner could possibly imagine just how much the Speed Twin would affect the British motorcycle industry. And so into the 1950s we see a plethora of these parallel twins. And so here are 6 of Britain's classic 1950s 500cc parallel twins. The Ariel KH500. The Valpage designed Ariel KH500 was introduced in 1948. Initially the machine was called the Red Hunter, but would later be renamed the Huntmaster and finally renamed again to the Fieldmaster towards the end of its production. And I think Ariel's naming system really didn't do the bike any favours and made it sound rustic and old-fashioned, and this negatively impacted on sales, particularly to younger riders, as it became looked on very much as an old man's bike. But to simply write the bike off as such would do it a great injustice. The Ariel was dependable and performed very well, top speed of around 90 miles an hour. And although designed by Valpage, the engine was quite different in basic design than the BSA A7, which he'd also penned a few years earlier. The Ariel used twin camshafts mounted fore and aft of the cylinders, just like the Triumph Speed Twin, which incidentally shared the same bore and stroke dimensions. Where the engine differed though was its crankshaft was not a bolt-up job, it was a single piece forging, although it did have a bolt-on flywheel weight in the middle. The engine was a 498cc with a bore and stroke of 56 by 86. There was a 7.5 compression ratio and of course dry sump lubrication. Peak power was said to be 28 horsepower at 6,500 rpm, and the bike used a Berman 4-speed gearbox. Ariel would later introduce the KHA with an aluminium head and barrel. This was a more sporty model, but was unfortunately very short-lived. Early models had telescopic forks but rigid rear ends. However, Ariel would later add their own anti-plunge suspension system as an option. However, all changed in 1954 with a major redesign which incorporated a swinging arm frame and a heavily revised engine with the aluminium head from the KHA but an iron barrel, and this design would see the bike through to its end in 1959. The Matchless G9. At the 1948 Earls Court show, Matchless introduced their all-new G9 Parallel Twin 500. The bike was the work of Phil Walker, and like so many Matchlesses, was that little bit different to everything else on the market. The design does have some similarities to the Speed Twin with its fore and aft camshafts, but the crankshaft is completely different, being unique amongst British twins because it has a central bearing, with that heavy nodular iron crankshaft being supported on each side by roller bearings with a plain shell bearing in the middle. Famously, this machine would be turned into the G45 Grand Prix racer, although that bike would run a different crank, because as Matchless soon discovered, a touring bottom end is not necessarily the best choice if you intended to go Grand Prix racing. Matchless G9 engine is a 498cc with a bore and stroke of 66 by 72.88. Compression ratio was 7.7 to 1, and Matchless would claim a peak power of just over 30 horsepower, although the machine only had a top speed in the 85 mile an hour bracket. However, one area where Matchless did steal a march was in the chassis, having a swinging arm rear suspension system and telescopic forks right from the start. The basic powertrain changed very little during the course of the bike's production run, although 1952 would see an all-new Berman gearbox. For much of the bike's production run, AMC would insist on using their own rear suspension units, rather than the off-the-shelf offerings offered by Girling. And the most famous of these, of course, was introduced in 1951, and was so bulky at the top end that it was nicknamed the Jampot unit, a name which has stuck and been synonymous with the bikes ever since. Perhaps even more so than even other 500s, the AMC 500 has been very much overlooked in recent years. The bike would latterly be joined by the 600cc G11 and the 650 G12, before being phased out in 1961. The Norton Dominator 88. The Norton Dominator was a work of former Triumph employee Bert Hopwood and was introduced in 1949 and was Norton's first parallel twin. The camshaft on the Norton ran at the front of the engine, with that single cam setting it apart from bikes such as the Ariel, Triumph and AMC twins. BSA's A7 would run a similar layout, but with the camshaft at the rear of the cylinders rather than the front, like the Norton. The first Dominator, the Model 7, used road holder front forks and had plunger rear suspension. This would be replaced by a swinging arm, however, in 1953. The engine was of 497 cc's, with a bore and stroke of 66 by 72.6. Compression ratio was 6.2 to 1, and Norton would claim 29 horsepower at 6,000 rpm, enough for just over 90 miles an hour. 1951 would see the adoption of the Matchless featherbed frame on the more sporty options, at least available for export at that point. The home market didn't get the bike until 1953. The engine was the same as the Model 7, but the chassis was way ahead, making the 88 the definitive Norton 500 twin. Triumph Tiger 100. The first Tiger 100 arrived in 1939 and was an evolution of the earlier Speed Twin. And although production was interrupted by the war, the Speed Twin and the Tiger would return at the cessation of hostilities, with the first models arriving in 1946 and seeming very little different from their earlier cousins, although of course they now adopted telescopic front forks. The rear end would remain rigid, although one option was the sprung hub. This had spring loading inside the wheel hub at the back. This would provide a fairly limited range of movement, the main impact of which was the negative effect it had on the bike's handling. In 1951 the bike was available with aluminium heads and barrels, with a race kit being made available for weekend heroes. In addition, in 1953, Triumph would introduce the T100C. This was a limited run of 560 fully race-kitted machines. Triumph would never offer the machine with plunger suspension, instead moving from the sprung hub to full swinging arm suspension in 1954. The Tiger 100's engine was of 498cc with twin cams mounted fore and after the cylinder block. Bore and stroke was 63 by 88 and there was a 7.6 to 1 compression ratio. Peak power was claimed at 32 horsepower at 6,500 rpm. The bike had a 4-speed gearbox of Triumph's own design with a up-for-up pattern and weighed in at just 170 kilos or 375 pounds. But despite the name, the bike wouldn't quite hit 100 miles an hour, with top speeds somewhere in the mid to late 90s. Still, not bad for a 1950s 500. Production of the Tiger 100 would continue through until 1959, when it was replaced by the all-new 5TA based unit construction Tiger 100. Royal Enfield Meteor Minor. Royal Enfield's Meteor Minor arrived in 1958, so it gets in by the skin of its teeth in a 1950s video selection. But it wasn't Royal Enfield's first parallel twin 500. That slightly dubious honour goes to the 500 twin. That was actually the bike's name. Very imaginative, I'm sure you'll agree. The 500 twin had a bottom end that was essentially sans bearings. In other words, it basically relied on oil pressure to keep everything together, which I'm sure went very well. The motor was, however, quite softly tuned, making just 25 horsepower, so a sporting model it definitely wasn't. On the plus side, Royal Enfield were very early adopters of swinging arm rear suspension, so the 500 twin boasted fine handling and was just the thing for dealing with Britain's post-war damaged roads. The 500 twin would of course steadily evolve during the 1950s, but in 1958 was replaced by an all-new model, the Meteor Minor, which although outwardly quite similar, was a very different beast to the early machine, having a much beefier bottom end thankfully. Like the outgoing 500 twin, the Meteor Minor ran separate alloy heads with iron barrels, although the dimensions of the new engine were quite different, running a bore and stroke of 70 by 64.5, which of course means the engine is over square. This gives a capacity of 496cc. Royal Enfield would make great play of the fact the engine was over square, giving that sort of reference to a sporty nature in a lot of their advertising blurb for the machine. And indeed, with his 8.1 compression ratio, Royal Enfield will claim that the bike put 33 horsepower for its Albion gearbox, enough for a highest one-way speed of an eye-watering 97 miles an hour when tested. Okay, to be honest, it was with quite a strong tailwind, and the average two-way speed was actually 89 miles an hour. but 90 miles an hour is pretty good going for 500 of the period. So with 95 mile an hour potential and an excellent chassis, the Meteor Miner is without doubt one of Britain's great unsung heroes of the 1950s. The BSA A7. Developed by Velpage during the war years, the A7 was introduced in 1946, and in its original form was a 495cc long-stroke parallel twin with a bore and stroke of 62 by 82. The original engine ran both iron head and barrels, and produced a claimed 26 horsepower, enough for top speed in the region of 85 miles an hour. At launch, the machine had a rigid rear end, but was available with telescopic forks. Plunger suspension would arrive in 1949, with proper swinging arm suspension a few years later in 1954. 1949 would see a major redesign of the engine, bringing it closer to the general dimensions and specs of the A10 designed by Burt Hopwood, and this would result in the 497cc engine with a bore and stroke of 66 by 72.6. This would see performance raised to 30 horsepower at 5,800 rpm, enough for a top speed of near 90, and this would be improved still further by the use of the aluminium head on the Shooting Star A7 SS model. The final major improvement was the adoption of the swinging arm frame in 1954. BSA would take the opportunity to change to a different gearbox. Previously the transmission had bolted directly to the back of the engine, but now it was separate to move in a more conventional pre-unit manner, allowing for a greater range of gearbox choices. So you could finally fit that close ratio racing gearbox to your little calf racer. What other bikes or selections of bikes would you like to see us cover in future videos? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.